To understand this difference, let's look briefly, first of all, at the Roman Catholic view. According to the Roman Catholic Church, the beginning of justification takes place at baptism. Baptism is said by the Church to be the instrumental cause of justification, or the means, the instrument by which justification begins in the person's life. And the reason for that is this: in the sacrament of baptism, according to the Roman Catholic Church, justifying grace, or the righteousness of Christ, is infused into the soul of the recipient of the sacrament. And what is meant by infusion here is that this grace is poured into the soul of the believer, which is the grace of the righteousness of Christ. Then the person who receives this infusion of grace must cooperate with that grace and assent to that grace. And the words that were used later at Trent were the Latin terms cooperare and assentare, to cooperate with and to assent to this infusion of the righteousness of Christ, to the extent that the person actually becomes righteous. Or, again, to use the language of the Council of Trent, until actual righteousness inheres within the believer. And only after that righteousness is inherent within the person will God declare such a person to be just in his sight. Now, initially, when one receives the grace of justification and cooperates with it and assents to it, the person is placed in a state of salvation where they remain unless or until they commit mortal sin. And we remember that mortal sin is called mortal because it kills this inhering, infused grace in the soul. And once that grace is destroyed by the commission of mortal sin, a person has to be justified again. And the rejustification comes through another sacrament, which is the sacrament of penance, which the Roman Catholic Church defines as the second plank of justification for those who have made shipwreck of their souls. The soul is made shipwreck by the commission of mortal sin. Salvation is lost. The only way it can be restored is through a fresh infusion of grace, which now comes through the sacrament of penance. It's not by accident that it was issues related to the sacrament of penance, particularly the issues of indulgences, that provoked the controversy with Luther in the first place. But over against this idea of infused righteousness that actually resides and abides within a person's soul, the Reformers taught that our justification is not by infusion, but by imputation. Now, imputation has to do with a legal declaration or legal decree that God does, by which he transfers or reckons or accounts one person's position for another. And this imputation is a two-way street. It works in two directions. First of all, the penalty for our sins is taken by Christ onto himself in the cross. In the atonement, Christ is the sin bearer, and he becomes the sin bearer when God transfers our guilt from us to him, fulfilling that which was symbolized in the Old Testament ritual of the Day of Atonement. And in addition to the sacrifice that was offered on the altar, Another animal was involved, namely the scapegoat, where the high priest, representing the nation, would symbolically place his hands on the back of this goat, the scapegoat. And that symbolism was to indicate the transfer or reckoning or accounting, or more specifically, the imputation of the sins of the people to the back of the goat. And after the sin and the guilt was transferred to the goat, then the goat was driven out into the wilderness, into the outer darkness.